got for the Oxbridge Network lectures for the next half term and into the autumn is a number of things. So first of all, if you are interested in physics, for example, but even if you're not, and it might help you broaden your mind, is we've got Chris Priestley from Tudor Grange, who's actually going to do a lecture on the physics of the internal combustion engine. And so that's on the 8th of June at 5 o'clock, and I'll be sending out the link to everybody. Those of you that are actually in Oxbridge Network schools, you will get the link via your Oxbridge coordinator or your head of Oxbridge. On the 16th of June, we've got an in-person lecture by Mr. Salmon, who's actually a barrister. It's at the Lecture Theatre in Solihull, and it's 5 o'clock onwards. This means that anybody who wants to do law will be able to ask him some quite serious questions, if you wish. And so we've got 2 lectures next half term. And then next term, we've got quite a lot planned at the moment. We're trying to get dates for a lot of the titles, but I've pinned down Dr. Amy Eagleton, and she's going to do a lecture on Thomas Hardy. There are going to be some lectures. There's going to be one on batteries by a student who's a PhD student in Oxford, and somebody else who's actually a student in Oxford as well, who's going to do a lecture on genetics. And I'm hoping to get somebody else who's actually a PhD student, DPhil student in Oxford, to do black holes. Now, the other things that are happening, and if you have not thought about doing this, there is an Oxbridge Network Essay Prize. If you have not actually thought about applying for it, then have a look at the details. Your Oxbridge Network coordinators or heads of Oxbridge should actually have all the details. If you find that you haven't got them, then please contact me and I'll send them to you. If you're in Solihull School, then I've put all the details on a files tab in the Oxbridge team, and the deadline is Year 12 for Year 12 is the 5th of June, right? So the Oxbridge Network Essay Prize is for Year 12 only. There is also a prize giving if we are going to, if you win a prize, then obviously Cambridge are coming on the 5th of July to present you with a prize. So it's worth you thinking about doing an essay for the network prize. On the 7th of June, and this is really very important, we've got an in-person admissions talk. So if, for example, you are interested in applying to Oxbridge and you are in a position where you'd like to ask some questions of an admissions tutor, then we are going to have a network admissions talk. So if you're in the upper 5th or in the lower 6th, this is the talk for you. There will be another one in September, but really you should be attending this one. And that's in the Lecture Theatre in Solihull. And on the 12th of June, we've got a student experience one, which is online, and you can ask as many questions as you like of real students from Cambridge. I've talked about Mr. Salmon's lecture and the prize giving, which is on the 5th of July with Cambridge present. Okay, anybody wants to know anything about that, please talk to me or contact your Oxbridge coordinator. Now, I am going to stop. I have stopped sharing, and I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Hart, who's going to talk to us about Virginia Woolf. And so we're all looking forward to this with anticipation, Dr. Hart. So many people have asked me for the recording already. And so within 2 or 3 days, guys, we will have the recording on the YouTube channel. And the YouTube channel, I will send a link out to all the Oxbridge coordinators, and I'll also put it on the Oxbridge team and also send it out to our lower, upper 5th, lower and upper 6th. Now, one thing, just a matter of housekeeping, there is a Q&A tab at the top of your screens. If you want to ask any questions, then please type your question into the Q&A tab, and then we will actually pick it up and deal with it at the end of the lecture. Okay, so I've disabled the chat. You will not be able to do that on the chat, but there is a Q&A for you to be able to do. Okay, Dr. Hart, I'm going to put my camera off and I'm going to keep my mouth shut, and over to you. We're looking forward to this talk on Virginia Woolf.
Right, thank you, Dr. Foster. Dr. Foster, can you see my screen? Is the slide come across okay?
Yes, the slides come across and I can see an ordinary mind on an ordinary day.
Fabulous, brilliant. Right, thank you. Good evening, everyone who's here. Lovely to see you all. And to those people, as Dr. Foster said, who can't make this evening, but who are going to join us by looking at it at a later date and watching the recording. So the focus for today's lecture is, as it says, Virginia Woolf and Literary Impressionism. And the title, as it says, An Ordinary Mind on an Ordinary Day. And there's a picture there of Virginia gazing out from her house in Rodmill Lewis. Now, I'm going to hopefully introduce a number of you to Virginia Woolf, who's one of the most eminent feminist writers of the 20th century, but also one of the kind of pioneers of the modernist movement as well. Now, some of you may already be familiar with Virginia Woolf, others less so. So over the course of the day, or of the course of the lecture rather, what I'm going to hope to do is kind of introduce you to her, think about where she sits as a kind of modernist writer in relation to the kind of modernist aesthetics, but also look at what kind of characterizes her writing in relation to perhaps the writers who went before her in the Edwardian period and also the Victorian period. So the lecture is probably going to last about 40 minutes, 45 minutes. Very happy to take some questions at the end. But hopefully, as I say, some of you may have a sense of Virginia Woolf, but hopefully, as a result of this evening's lecture, fingers crossed, it might encourage you to go away and read a little bit more of Virginia Woolf, whether it's some more of her letters or whether it's some of her kind of feminist polemics. So starting off, there's a number of slides here that I'm going to go through. So the first one is just to try and sketch out a little bit of information about who Virginia Woolf was. So she was born in 1882, so towards the end of the Victorian period, and she lived up to 1941. She was the daughter of the eminent Victorian man of letters, Leslie Stephen, and perhaps more significantly, she was the sister of the artist Vanessa Bell, which we'll discuss a little bit later. Now, Woolf was considered by many to be one, as I said, one of the leading figures of the European modernist movement. She was also one of the leading feminist voices of the 20th century, and many of you may be aware of her from the title of her most famous feminist polemic, A Room of One's Own, which was published in 1929. Woolf was also a key member of the Bloomsbury group of artists and philosophers. This was a group of about 8 or 9, maybe 10 people. Some of them included art critics such as Roger Fry or Clive Bell. It also included novelists such as E.M. Forster. We also have historians such as Lytton Strachey, economists such as John Maynard Keynes, and also artists such as her sister Vanessa Bell. So you may have heard of the Bloomsbury Group, and she was right at the very, very heart of that. And the Bloomsbury Group, as the name suggests, was situated in the centre of London. Now, Woolf was also a publisher. Along with her husband, Leonard Woolf, she started the Hogarth Press. And they started it in the basement of their house in Bloomsbury. As I say in the slide there, Virginia was beset with mental health issues throughout her life and eventually committed suicide in 1941. And her husband, Leonard, thought that actually starting up your own printing press and playing around with that might be quite a nice distraction for her. And indeed, she really kind of focused her mind on that to the extent that most of her novels, actually, with the exception of The Voyage Out, most of her novels were in fact published by the Hogarth Press. So that's a bit of a sketch about her. So she was born into the Victorian period, and say she was part of that Bloomsbury group. She was known as a key figure in the kind of European modernist movement, but also a leading 20th century feminist voice as well. So that's a little bit about who she is. Now, in terms of her novels, we can see that she wrote a number of novels of which you may be familiar. The Voyage Out was her very first, and then she moves into Day and Night. And then, interestingly, she becomes more experimental. Once she hits the 1920s, we see a slight shift in her style, and I'll be explaining that in more detail in the coming minutes. In Jacob's Room and in Mrs. Dalloway and The Lighthouse, we see her really develop this modernist style, which is more of a kind of psychological, inward-looking narrative style. And here she really hones that kind of modernist aesthetic, that literary impressionistic style, which reaches its kind of zenith with The Waves in 1931. So she wrote quite a number of novels. Perhaps these days the most celebrated is Mrs. Dalloway, and that's the one that appears on a number of exam syllabuses. Though perhaps of all of them, I would say that perhaps To the Lighthouse is perhaps the most lyrical, the most musical in its style. The Waves is perhaps the most experimental. So if you haven't already, do dip into some of those, most definitely. Between the Acts, that was published after her death. As I say, regrettably, very tragically, she took her own life in 1941, and her husband, Leonard Woolf, published Between the Acts after her death. Also going back, actually, you can see those are some of the illustrations from some of the covers, and her sister Vanessa Bell, as I said, who was an artist and was also part of the Bloomsbury group, she often illustrated the covers. And this middle one, The Common Reader, that's not a novel. That is part of her journalistic writing or her literary criticism. Virginia Woolf wrote for the Times Literary Supplement, and there's a massive outpouring of articles, kind of journalistic articles, but also kind of literary reviews that she wrote as well, which you can still get and are very interesting. And indeed, we look at some of them in the coming slides. Now, I think it's important, before we start talking about Virginia Woolf and her contribution in particular towards kind of modernist aesthetics and literary impressionism, I think it's important for us to kind of situate her within a particular context. Now, as I say, she primarily, we think of her in terms of a modernist writer, and in terms of modernism, we're thinking largely that period from about 1915, 1916 through to about 1930. So I think it's important, before we can kind of gauge the contribution that she made and why she was so experimental in terms of what she did, in terms of her writing style, we need to go back a little bit and just kind of remind ourselves of what the norms were before that. So let's just have a look at and kind of remind ourselves of Victorian literature. So when we think of Victorian literature, we're thinking of that period that kind of spans the life of Queen Victoria, so 1837 through to 1901. Now, as you're probably aware, Victorian literature in part directed its attention towards social issues such as the dehumanizing effect of the Industrial Revolution, as well as the abject poverty that was found in cities such as London. It was often characterized by a very kind of moralizing, didactic element, and it called for social reform. And many writers questioned the existing class structures and various hierarchies that existed in society at this time, which tended to kind of perpetuate the social inequalities, which included the marginalisation of women, but also the disenfranchisement of the masses. Now, writers such as Charles Dickens, George Eliot, Elizabeth Gaskell, Thomas Hardy, and also the Bronte sisters, perhaps to a lesser extent, kind of focused on these concerns. And you can see that etching on the left, that's by Gustave Doré, and it kind of captures the bleakness of the Victorian metropolis, the kind of cramped living conditions, the abject poverty. We can see the reference to the kind of the growth of the railway network by the train right at the very, very top. And writers such as Dickens, Eliot, Gaskell, they were very interested in kind of exposing the inequalities that existed in Victorian society at this time. If we think of the likes of Dickens, we think of the likes of Bleak House and Oliver Twist, which focused on the abject poverty. Now, also stylistically, Victorian literature was quite interesting because of the way they created these very kind of encyclopedic plots and their range of characters, and also the way in which very often their novels were very much plot driven. There was lots going on in the novels, and they had these wealth of characters and these very intricate plots. And also in terms of the style, they focused upon lots of external description. That it wasn't very inward looking. You didn't really get these psychological narratives that you find in modernist novels, such as what we find in Woolf. They were more kind of focused on external descriptions of the characters and what that revealed. So the whole physiognomy of the character and what that revealed about their kind of temperament or values. So that was Victorian literature. And here are some examples here. George Eliot's Middlemarch, which calls for social reform. Elizabeth Gaskell talking about the divide, the social inequalities between North and South. We've got Dickens at the top there with his kind of wealth of characters. And then we've got the three Bronte sisters at the bottom. So that was Victorian literature. When we move on from Victorian literature from kind of 1901 up to about 1914, that's known roughly as the kind of the period of Edwardian literature. Now, the period was marked in part by a celebration of nationalism and also imperialism. So if we think of the kind of the British Empire at the end of the Victorian period and that kind of smugness, that celebration, that jingoistic nationalism, much of that is reflected in Edwardian literature of the time. It was also just before the First World War. It was also a time of peace and, for the most part, economic prosperity. We also see kind of technological and scientific progression being celebrated as well. Also, naturally, not just the beginning of a new era after the death of Queen Victoria, but also the beginning of a new century. So it heralded a time of change for many people. And indeed, we see an increased call for female suffrage at this time. A new era, a new century, new opportunities, new hope. So we see kind of increased calls for female suffrage. Also, it's important to note that at this time, we see the voice of the working class become increasingly more prominent. We see the establishment of the trade union movement and the Labour Party. We see writers such as George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells kind of championing the rights of the working classes. And we see the kind of evolution of this kind of socialist sentiment in many corners of Britain. Many writers of the time included E.M. Forster, such as we see here in the painting. We also see Arnold Bennett, Rudyard Kipling, and many of the other writers of the time. A number of Edwardian writers did kind of look back upon the previous Victorian period, and they kind of challenged what they saw as Victorian notions of emotional and sexual repression. There was a kind of a shift away from that. And indeed, we see E.M. Forster with his novel Morris exploring what it meant to be gay in Edwardian England. So they kind of embraced and they were exploring kind of more progressive ideas at this time. Now, also, there was another kind of literary or artistic movement that was kind of in existence that kind of ran alongside almost the kind of Victorian period, which was known as the aesthetic movement. And again, this is important for us to kind of have a sense of, so we can make sense of what Virginia Woolf was doing. So as many of you guys may know, between 1860 and 1900, we see a group of artists, but also architects and designers emerge who were united in their search for a new form of beauty. This was known as the aesthetic movement. Now, it eschewed traditional Victorian ideas of morality and didacticism. They also rejected the notion that art was primarily a means of self-improvement, and that the purpose of art, whether it was kind of in a visual form or whether it was in a novel, was that art should be a catalyst for good works. It should kind of teach us a moral, or it should be a form of kind of like social reform or change. The aesthetic movement challenged this notion. Their mantra was, after Walter Pater's comment in the Renaissance, art for art's sake. They championed the idea that art should delight in visual beauty and sensual pleasure, rather than be a form of kind of morality and didacticism. Key figures of the aesthetic movement included Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Christina Rossetti, the poet, who many of you may be familiar with, Swinburne, William Morris, who many of you may be familiar with, Edward Burne-Jones, Whistler, Walter Pater, the art critic, Arthur Symonds, the kind of champion of symbolist French poetry, and also the decadent writer Oscar Wilde. And these were the key figures of the kind of the aesthetic movement. As I say, they championed works of great beauty, and they suggested that art should offer sensual pleasure. It should offer an aesthetic delight. And so therefore they were kind of moving away from this notion of art being a catalyst for moral improvement. Also at this time, as we see a growth in kind of travel, we see influences coming across from Japan and different kind of Asian art forms rising to prominence. Also at this time, concurrently, we see the arts and crafts movement and artisans who sought beauty in the domestic sphere of the home. And throughout this, as I said, there was a focus on beauty and style over moral instruction. However, the aesthetic movement did have its critics, and many people admonished it for its seeming decadence or its decline of taste. And we can see there a kind of pre-Raphaelite painting. And indeed, many of you can go to the Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery in town, and we have the most extraordinary collection of pre-Raphaelite paintings and works. And this kind of was bred out of this aesthetic movement. So if you've got a spare afternoon, do go and look at these marvelous pre-Raphaelite paintings. And here also we can see what we mean by the aesthetic movement. So on the left hand side, we've got a fabulous print by William Morris. We also see the kind of Japanese influence in the top right hand corner, and then in the bottom right hand corner we also see this artwork whereby, unlike a great deal of kind of Victorian artwork, which is moralizing, it depicts, I don't know, prostitutes who are down on their luck, or it depicts folk who are kind of suffering from poverty in the streets of London. Instead, we have an image that offers sensual beauty, and it delights in beauty for its own sake. So we've looked at Victorian literature, we've looked at Edwardian literature, we've looked at the arts and crafts movement, which kind of existed at the back end of that Victorian period. And as I said, it's really important for us to kind of recognize what went before the modernist period, so we have a sense of what Virginia Woolf was doing. So if we look, as I say, if we look at the modernist period and what we mean by the modernist period, we're looking at about 1915 to 1930. Okay, so what was going on at this time? Well, as that image there from Nash suggests, during this time, the First World War, okay, had just come to an end. the First World War, this was the first industrial or technological war. It was the first time that machines from the technological age had been used to kill people on an unprecedented scale. And consequently, the First World War, it was a source of much cultural anxiety. Traditional ideas were dislocated and shattered. Furthermore, as we see, for example, in T.S. Eliot's modernist poem, The Wasteland, and also the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, the metropolis was seen as a place of alienation and corruption. And this comes across in a lot of the modernist novels as well, of James Joyce's with Ulysses, but also Virginia Woolf. Also at this particular time as well, we see the psychoanalytical theories of Sigmund Freud, which provided new ways of thinking about the self. Freud really kind of focused people's attention on what was going on in the mind, and really thought about turning people's attention inward looking. And interestingly, as I said, Virginia Woolf and Leonard Woolf had their own printing press and their own publishing company, the Hogarth Press, that they kind of set up from their basement. And they indeed were the people who first published Freud's work in English in this country. They, as I say, they brought Freud's psychoanalytical ideas to the English-speaking world through their translations. So it's perhaps no surprise that Virginia Woolf's own narratives were very inward looking, and they kind of explored the psychological complexities of what it meant to be human. Also at this time in the modernist period, we see the French philosopher Henry Bergson. He challenged existing theories relating to time, and along with William James, who was the brother of the novelist Henry James, he championed the idea of the stream of consciousness, which many of you guys may have heard of before. Bergson and William James, they created this notion of the stream of consciousness and time, and they played around with ideas of time. And indeed, this became a motif for modernist writers such as Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, and Catherine Mansfield. So those are some of the kind of touchstones that we think about when we kind of think of the modernist period. In addition to this, it was also a period of great radical experimentation in terms of literature, the visual arts, philosophy, music, as you can see by that image there, that kind of still life image to the left. Writers included clearly Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, Catherine Mansfield, but also Marcel Proust. We've got Joseph Conrad, Franz Kafka, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and Gertrude Stein, which many of you guys may be familiar with. If not, dip in, have a look at those guys. Novelists and poets were very influenced by what had gone on before. And as I said, these new theories, Freud's new theories, that kind of cultural anxiety that has come about as a result of the First World War, increasing questions about social reform, about increased rights for women. The modernist writers and artists kind of played around with these ideas, and there were ongoing conversations, and they wanted to reject Victorian and also Edwardian ideas, which they saw as being outdated. Now, also, interestingly, the novelists and poets were very much influenced by the Impressionist and post-Impressionist painters of this time. The Impressionist, post-Impressionist painters championed new ways of looking at the world. For example, as I say, such as that image on the left there. There was a greater focus upon internal, introspective, psychological ways of seeing and also experiencing the world. They were captivated by what the Impressionist, post-Impressionist painters were doing, and they wanted to try and replicate those ideas in prose. And we can see that in the visual arts, there was a rejection of Victorian realism and those kind of naturalistic, almost photographic styles of painting. And similarly, writers tried to eschew those kind of conventional ideas of syntax and form. And if we look at some of these images on this slide here, this kind of typifies in many ways the kind of Victorian style, whilst it's not kind of didactic or moralizing, as I referred to earlier. What you can see in these images is this this kind of very realistic, very naturalistic, almost photographic at times, the very, very intricate brush strokes. And that characterized in many ways Victorian art, Victorian kind of visual representations, but also in many ways novels as well. What these artists are doing here through their intricate brushstrokes, creating a photographic, naturalistic image of reality. That's what the likes of Dickens was trying to do, or Zola, or many of those kind of Victorian writers, or Thackeray. Whereas actually the post-impressionists and the impressionist writers were trying to do something very, very different. And if we look here, in the top right-hand corner, we have Cézanne. Now, Cézanne, you can see he's playing around with shape and form and colour in a very different way, and also kind of Monet at the bottom. Again, the kind of brush strokes are freer, they're looser, there's more of an emphasis upon playing around with the transient nature of light. And on the left, we see Virginia Woolf's sister, Vanessa Bell. Again, it's kind of eschews or rejects that naturalistic photographic style that we see in the previous slide, and it focuses more on form and color and shape. So if we go to the previous slide, as I say, very photographic, very naturalistic. When we move on to this one, it feels very, very different. As I say, it looks at the transient nature of light, the impermanence, the brevity of the way in which light creates different shadows, but also the way in which we see forms and shape in real life, and the kind of psychological process. So they were more interested. The post-impressionist and impressionist painters, such as Van Gogh, we think of Monet, we think of Manet, those kind of guys were doing something very, very different, and it was radical, it was experimental. And the novelists and the poets wanted to kind of replicate that. So this idea on seeing the world differently and capturing the world in psychologically in a slightly different form. Now, if we move on to the next slide, again, we can see we've got Van Gogh right in the top right. We've also got Cézanne at the bottom right, which almost looks unfinished. And then we've got this picture of the poet T.S. Eliot in the main slide. Now, when many of these impressionist and post-impressionist paintings were first kind of shown in this country, in Roger Fry's 1910 post-impressionist exhibition, it came under great criticism because people thought, what's going on here? These paintings are half finished, they're not complete. Is this a joke? People didn't get it because it offered new ways of seeing the world. And in many ways, as I say, this offers a new kind of psychological, it captures the complexity of human experience and the way in which we perceive the world around us, playing around with form and colour and the transience of light. So let's just try and capture what that means. And we've got an image here, a still life by Picasso. So according to the Bloomsbury critic, Clive Bell, who was married to Virginia Woolf's sister and artist Vanessa Bell, the significant form of an artwork can be expressive, even if it is seemingly divorced from a recognizable reality. So if it's not photographic or naturalistic. In his book Art, he stated that lines and colour combined in a particular way, certain forms and relations of forms, they stir our aesthetic emotions. And many of the Impressionists include Monet, Renoir, Degas and Cézanne. Impressionism, instead of painting in a studio, the Impressionists found that they could capture the momentary and transient, in other words, fleeting effects of sunlight by working quickly in front of their subjects in the open air, rather than in a studio. Now, this resulted in a greater awareness of light and colour and the shifting pattern of the natural scene. Brushwork, as we've seen on those images, became rapid and broken into separate dabs in order to render the fleeting quality of light. Now, writers such as Virginia Woolf, Catherine Mansfield, they tried to emulate this in their kind of literary impressionism. They tried to capture the same thing that the likes of Monet and Degas were doing in the visual arts. They tried to do the same thing in the kind of the literary arts. Post-impressionists, we think of Cézanne, Van Gogh, Gauguin and Seurat as well, with his kind of his pointillist style. Now, the term was first coined by the art critic and the Bloomsbury member and a great friend of Virginia Woolf, Roger Fry, when he organised the 1910 exhibition. So that's a bit of a context, and we can see here some images. So this is Vanessa Bell in the top right. That's Virginia Woolf's sister. She was very much influenced by the post-impressionists and the impressionists, and she herself became one of those. And in that image, in the large image, that is actually a portrait of Virginia Woolf sat in her garden in Lewes. And there's you can see in the bottom right, that's also an image of her husband, Clive Bell. And then also, I think it's Duncan Grant on the right. And we can see the style is very different to that naturalistic photographic style. So Virginia's own sister, Vanessa Bell, was playing around with these kind of impressionistic ideas. And then when they all came together as a group, as a Bloomsbury group, they were having these conversations about style and art and what it meant. So it naturally kind of influenced the writing of Virginia. And here we see this time a post-impressionist painting by Duncan Grant of Vanessa Bell on the left-hand side, and then on the right again another of Vanessa Bell's paintings. And we can see a real focus on colour, establishing a mood, focus on form, not realistic in terms of shapes, but instead evoking a sense of atmosphere and mood, or the fleeting transient nature of light. And again, we get some more here. Again, on the left-hand side, that's Vanessa Bell, Virginia's sister, who's produced a kind of self-portrait. And in the top right-hand corner, that's one of Vanessa's portraits of her sister, Virginia. And again, interestingly, whenever she paints Virginia, she doesn't paint in the details of the face. And that's quite interesting, because it says a lot about questions of identity and a sense of self. It asks a number of questions. Now, in the bottom right hand corner, you can see that is a photograph of Vanessa Bell's home in East Sussex called Charleston, which you can go and visit. And it's a real kind of artistic house, and you can see that they've painted lots of the furniture, and it's a real celebration of the kind of impressionistic and post-impressionistic style. And I really do kind of recommend people go there. It's the most extraordinary experience in which kind of life mimics art and vice versa. So, as I said, getting on to Virginia Woolf. So naturally, the Bloomsbury group, they were interested, excited, talking about new ideas, modernist ideas, what was going on in the world, how the world was shifting in terms of its values, its ideas, the legacy of the First World War, and how that had created a kind of dislocation of thought and ideas and a sense of cultural anxiety. Ideas about Freud and the self, developments in terms of psychology, but also ideas to do with painting. All of these conversations took place, and the Bloomsbury group were great talkers. They would sit around and they would talk. They would have these philosophical discussions, talking about art and what it meant and our perception of the world around us. So naturally, this kind of impacted on Virginia Woolf, and she wanted to create a kind of literary aesthetic that captured that sense of the moment and this excitement. And she wanted to experiment in a literary form what the artists were doing in a kind of visual form, and she kind of put down some ideas. She kind of created a theory of fiction that I'd like to kind of share with you here. So she wrote an essay in 1925, Modern Fiction, in which she says, examine for a moment an ordinary day on an ordinary mind on an ordinary day. The mind receives a myriad impressions, trivial, fantastic, evanescent, or engraved with the sharpness of steel. From all sides they come, an incessant shower of innumerable atoms, and as they fall, as they shape themselves into the life of Monday or Tuesday, the accent falls differently from of old. That's important, from of old. The moment of importance came not here, but there. So that if a writer were a free man and not a slave, if he could write what he chose, not what he must, if he could base his work upon his own feeling and not upon convention, and again, that's important, there would be no plot, no comedy, no tragedy, no love interest or catastrophe in the accepted style, and perhaps not a single button sewn on as the Bond Street tailors would have it. Life is not a series of gig lamps symmetrically arranged. Life is a luminous halo, a semi-transparent envelope surrounding us from the beginning of consciousness to the end. It is not the task of the novelist to convey this varying, this unknown, and this uncircumscribed spirit, whatever aberration or complexity may display, with as little mixture of the alien and external as possible. We are not pleading merely for courage and sincerity. We are suggesting that the proper stuff of fiction is a little other than custom would have us believe it. Now, despite my poor reading of that, you can see that actually she's putting forward a real kind of revolutionary call for literature to change. That's for some reason. There we go. That's good. Somebody's tried to call me there. So we can see there, can't we, that there's a real shift. She's calling for a very different form of fiction. She's saying that we should reject conventions. We should kind of reject the idea of novels being plot driven or having a particular formula. And actually, we should focus more on consciousness. We should focus more on what it means to be. So it is not the task. Is it not the task of the novelist to convey this varying, this unknown, this uncircumscribed spirit, whatever aberration or complexity it may? So she's saying, is it not right that we should perhaps have the courage to look for something different and to kind of reject the custom? Now, what that means is rejecting those long plot-driven narratives that we find in the likes of Dickens or Arnold Bennett. And instead of focusing on these external descriptions of characters, actually, let's turn the focus inwards. Let's provide more psychological narratives. So she also said this as well. So this is from an essay called Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, which was written in 1924. And now I will hazard a second assertion, which is more disputable, perhaps, to the effect that on or about December 1910, human character changed. And she goes on, and I'll go towards the bottom of that paragraph. All human relations have shifted, those between masters and servants, husbands and wives, parents and children. And when human relations change, there is at the same time a change in religion, conduct, politics, and literature. Let us agree to place one of these changes about the year 1910. But now I must recall what Mr. Arnold Bennett says. He says that it is only if the characters are real that the novel has any chance of surviving. Otherwise, die it must. But I ask myself, what is reality? And who are the judges of reality? A character may be real to Mr. Bennett and quite unreal to me. Now, here Virginia Woolf is arguing for this notion that, as she says, around about 1910, there was a shift, there was a change. The normal kind of social hierarchies that we see in the Victorian period, suddenly there started to be a slightly more kind of progressive shift, and those social hierarchies began to kind of break down a little bit. And we see a greater sense of social mobility. Relations between the classes started to shift. So she's arguing that naturally, if human relations have shifted, and if there is a shift in human character around about 1910, well, then that needs to be reflected in the literature of the time. And she's kind of taking issue with Arnold Bennett, who was one of the Edwardian writers that we kind of referenced earlier. And she's suggesting that actually we need a new kind of aesthetics, a new kind of way of expressing what it is to be human at this time. So she's asking for a more kind of psychological form of writing. So along with the essay Modern Fiction, which we see here, and here she's arguing for a new aesthetics, and in particular she's arguing for a form of literary impressionism similar to what we see in the visual artists. So how does that look? What does that look like in a novel form? Well, in particular, I'd like us to look in a kind of final, we're probably going to go over past 7 o'clock actually. We're going to look at To the Lighthouse by looking at some extracts, if that's okay. So, as I said, in To the Lighthouse, we see Woolf's mastery of this new modernist aesthetics, this impressionistic style. So she rejects the conventions of the Victorian or the Edwardian novelists, such as Dickens or the likes of Arnold Bennett. Her novel is not driven by a fast-paced melodramatic plot structure, nor does it attempt a self-improving moralism such as we see in the kind of Victorians. Rather, through its lyricism and its musicality, as well as its painterly use of colour, as well as its kind of transient focus on light and the poetic cadences and rhythms, instead it captures an aesthetic mood or atmosphere through focusing on a handful of moments and exploring these through the complex inner lives of its characters. In doing so, the novel offers a psychological exploration of what it means to be human. As one of her characters, Lily Briscoe, asks in the novel To the Lighthouse, for how could one express in words these emotions of the body? Express the emptiness there. So Woolf believes that actually, rather than having these very expansive encyclopedic plots such as we see in Thackeray or Dickens, instead she's going to focus on an ordinary mind on an ordinary day, and we're going to have a more kind of psychological kind of novel. It's going to attain more to a state of kind of musicality and lyricism that's almost akin to poetry. Let's just have a look at this extract if we could. No, she thought, and this is, so this is taken from To the Lighthouse. No, she thought, putting together some of the pictures he had cut out. This is Mrs. Ramsay. A refrigerator, a mowing machine, a gentleman in evening dress. Children never forget. For this reason, it was so important what one said and what one did, and it was a relief when they went to bed. For now, she need not think about herself. She could be herself, by herself. And that was what now she often felt the need of, to think. Well, not even to think, to be silent, to be alone. All the being and the doing, expansive, glittering, vocal, evaporated. And one shrunk with a sense of solemnity to being oneself. A wedge-shaped core of darkness, something invisible to others. Although she continued to knit and sat upright, it was thus that she felt herself. And this self, having shed its attachments, was free from the strangest adventures. When life sank down for a moment, the range of experience seemed limitless, and to everybody there was always this sense of unlimited resources, she supposed. One after another, she, Lily, and Augustus Carmichael must feel our apparitions. The things you know us by are simply childish. Beneath it is all dark. It is all spreading. It is unfathomably deep. But now and again we rise to the surface, And that is what you see us by. Her horizon seemed to her limitless. There were all the places she had not seen. The Indian plains, she felt herself pushing aside the thick leather curtain of a church in Rome. This core of darkness could go anywhere, for no one saw it. They could not stop it, she thought, exulting. There was freedom, there was peace, there was most welcome of all, a summoning together, a resting on a platform of stability. Not as oneself did one find rest ever in her experience. She accomplished her something dexterous with her needles. But as a wedge of darkness, losing personality, one lost the fret, the hurry, the stir, and there rose to her lips always some exaltation of triumph over life when things came together in this peace, this rest, this eternity. And pausing there, she looked out to meet that stroke of the lighthouse, the long, steady stroke, the last of the three, which was her stroke. For watching them in this mood always at this hour, one could not help attaching oneself to one thing, especially of the things one saw. And this thing, the long, steady stroke, was her stroke. Often she found herself sitting and looking with her work in her hands, until she became the thing she looked at, that light, for example, and it would lift up on it some little phrase or other which had been lying in her mind like that. Children don't forget, children don't forget, which she would repeat and begin adding to it. It will end, she said. It will come, when suddenly she added, we are in the hands of the Lord. Now here, not very much happens there, but that's a very typical passage from To the Lighthouse. To the Lighthouse focuses on the inner lives of two characters in particular. Mrs. Ramsay, who is married to a very important moral philosopher, and they've got this holiday home in Cornwall that overlooks a lighthouse, and they have people staying with them, lots of different interesting people, artists such as Lily Briscoe. But it captures the inner life of Mrs. Ramsay. And as we see at the beginning of that passage, those feelings of frustration whereby her identity is compromised, her sense of self is compromised as a result of her responsibilities by being a mother to her children, but also being a wife to her husband. And it's those periods at the end of the day when she can relinquish those responsibilities and have a room of her own, whereby she can kind of shed those responsibilities and focus on herself and reconnect with herself. And she can dream about the prospects of having the liberty and freedom to travel abroad, to France, to Italy, to Rome, to India, and to kind of reconnect with who she is as a person. And we see here these mellifluous sentences and the kind of lyricism and the musicality of her prose. It's more poetic. Whereas in Dickens, we see these plot-driven narratives. We see these external descriptions. Whereas here, we see the narrative focus inwards. We experience this impressionistic style. We see the complexity of what it means to be human and the kind of psychological thought processes that Mrs. Ramsay experiences. So this was very, very radical. Now, these days, lots of novelists use this inner monologue, this stream of consciousness style, but this was very, very experimental. And as I said, Virginia Woolf was kind of responding to these ideas of William James and also Henry Bergson in terms of these ideas of stream of consciousness. And as I said, these kind of impressionistic moments of being, so not plot-driven narratives, but just focusing on an ordinary mind on an ordinary day. So here we are reminded in this particular extract from the novel of Woolf's comment from her essay Modern Fiction. So if you remember, she says in that, the mind receives a myriad impressions, trivial, fantastic, evanescent, or engraved with the sharpness of steel, and from all sides they come, an incessant shower of innumerable atoms, and as they fall, they shape themselves into the life of Monday or Tuesday. So this impressionistic focus on moments and how psychologically we interpret these. Again, this is reflected in this passage. So, and what was even more exciting, she felt too, as she saw Mr. Ramsay bearing down and retreating, and Mrs. Ramsay sitting with James in the window. This is Lily Briscoe, and the cloud moving and the tree bending, how life, from being made up of little separate incidents which one lived one by one, became curled and whole like a wave which bore one up with it and threw one down with it there with a dash on the beach. Here, this focus on little separate incidents which kind of come together and they curl together like a wave. That's very kind of impressionistic, the lyricism of the prose, that making sense of moments. Life isn't full of big dramatic key moments like we might find in a Dickensian novel, but instead it's made up of quotidian moments, and it's how we perceive those. If we move on to the next, again, we see a similar thing here, where she says, for in the rough and tumble of daily life, with all those children about, all those visitors, one had constantly a sense of repetition, of one thing falling where another had fallen, and so setting up an echo which chimed in the air and made it full of vibrations. That notion, an echo which chimed in the air and made it full of vibrations. Again, very impressionistic, very lyrical, very musical. I guess, if anything, what I want you to take from this lecture is reading a Woolf novel is a slow process. The mellifluous nature, the syrupy, the poetic, the musicality of the prose demands that we read it slowly, and we delight, we take pleasure in sentence upon sentence, these tapestry of sentences which create these marvelous impressions. There's something to delight. So the notion of the aesthetic movement from 1860 to 1900 celebrated this notion of art for art's sake, and we see it here, don't we, celebrating sentences for their own delight. And again, another sentence here kind of highlighted in red. It must have been his mother, he thought, sitting on a low chair with his father standing over her. He began to search among the infinite series of impressions which time had laid. This notion of impressions is very, very important. And again, this kind of notion of impressionistic moments of being. And here, through the kind of focus on momentary sensations and how we make sense of them, and momentary thoughts and their kind of profound significance, we see it here. Like a work of art, she repeated, looking from her canvas. So this is Lily Briscoe, who's kind of painting, looking from her canvas to the drawing room steps and back again. She must rest for a moment. And resting, looking from one to the other vaguely, the old question which traversed the sky of the soul perpetually, the vast, the general questions which was apt to particularize itself at such moments as these, when she realized faculties that had been on the strain, stood over her, paused over her, darkened over her. What is the meaning of life? That was all, a simple question, one that tended to close in on one with years. The great revelation had never come. The great revelation perhaps never did come. Instead, there were little daily miracles, illuminations, matches struck unexpectedly in the dark. Here was one, this, that, and the other. Herself and Charles Tansley in the breaking wave. Mrs. Ramsay bringing them together. Mrs. Ramsay saying, life, stand still here. Mrs. Ramsay making of the moment something permanent, as in another sphere Lily herself tried to make of the moment something permanent. This was of the nature of a revelation. In the midst of chaos there was shape, this eternal parting and flowing. She looked at the clouds going and the leaves shaking. So again, this notion of particular moments and the way in which just in the quotidian, the ordinary, the everyday, we can find something profound and extraordinary, a revelation. This is what we see in these kind of Virginia Woolf moments that she focuses on, and these kind of philosophical questions. As I said, the novels, they're not driven by kind of big, expansive, dramatic, kind of plot-driven events. They're introspective, they're thoughtful, they're speculative, they're philosophical. They're for people who like to think. Now, in the next slide, the relationship between painting and writing is made even more explicit through Woolf's depiction of the complex inner thoughts of the painter Lily Briscoe, who's working on her canvas. Here, to replicate Briscoe's meandering thoughts as well as the application of her brushstrokes, Woolf adopts, again, this kind of impressionistic painterly style through her mellifluous syntax and sentence structure. So, writing's too small for me to read, so I'll read this quickly because I know that time's not on our side. With a curious physical sensation, as if she were urged forward and at the same time must hold herself back, she made her first quick, decisive stroke. The brush descended. It flickered brown over the white canvas. It left a running mark. A second time she did it, a third time. And so pausing and so flickering, she attained a dancing rhythmical movement, as if the pauses were one part of the rhythm and the strokes another, and all were elated. Again, notice the rhythm with which she describes the rhythm of painting. And so, lightly and swiftly, pausing, striking, she scored her canvas with brown, running nervous lines, which had no sooner settled there than they enclosed. She felt it looming out of her, a space. Down in the hollow of one wave, she saw the next wave towering higher and higher above her. For what could be more formidable than that space? Here she was again, she thought, stepping back to look at it, drawn out of gossip, out of living, out of community with people into the presence of this formidable ancient enemy of hers, this other thing, this truth, this reality, which suddenly laid hands on her, emerged stark at the back of appearances and commanded her attention. She was half unwilling, half reluctant. Why always be drawn out and haled away? Why not left in peace to talk to Mr. Carmichael on the lawn? It was an exacting form of intercourse anyhow. Other worshipful objects were content with worship. Men, women, God, all let one kneel prostrate. But this form, were it only the shape of a white lampshade looming on a wicker table, roused one to perpetual combat, challenged one to a fight in which one was bound to be worst. Always it was in her nature or in her sex, she did not know which. Before she exchanged the fluidity of life for the concentration of painting, she had a few moments of nakedness, when she seemed like an unborn soul, a soul reft of body, hesitating on some windy pinnacle and exposed without protection to all the blasts of doubt. Why then did she do it? She looked at the canvas, lightly scored with running lines. It would be hung in the servants' bedrooms. It would be rolled up and stuffed under a sofa. What was the good of doing it then? And she heard some voice saying she couldn't paint, saying she couldn't create, as if she were caught up in one of those habitual currents which after a certain time forms experience in her mind, so that one repeats words without being aware any longer who originally spoke them. Can't paint, can't write, she murmured monotonously, anxiously considering what her plan of attack should be. For the mass loomed before her, it protruded, she felt it pressing on her eyeballs. Then, as if some juice necessary for the lubrication of her faculties was spontaneously squirted, she began precariously dipping among the blues and umbers, moving her brush hither and thither. But it was now heavier and went slower, as if it had fallen in with some rhythm which was dictated to her. She kept looking at that hedge at the canvas, by what she saw, so that while her hand quivered with life, this rhythm was strong enough to bear her along with it on its current. Certainly she was losing consciousness of outer things. And as she lost consciousness of outer things, and her name and her personality and her appearance, and whether Mr. Carmichael was there or not, her mind kept throwing up from its depths scenes and names and sayings and memories and ideas, like a fountain spurting over that glaring, hideously difficult white space. Now, that's really quite interesting, in as much as A, it connects her interest in painting with writing. Obviously, this conversation about the difficulty and that sense of being exposed and vulnerable when you see a sign and you try and render that on a canvas. Those conversations may have come with conversations that she's had with her sister, Vanessa Bell, but also in part that notion of the artist and creating a form that captures the essence of something. In many ways, this is almost a metaphor for the process of writing. So it's not just Lily Briscoe and how she interprets the scene and represents it in a visual form, but it also tells us something about Virginia Woolf's own processes of capturing something in a written form as well, this experience of creating something and capturing a form, an essence, the life of something. But as I said, also that kind of impressionistic style, the mellifluence of the sentences, the lyrical musicality of the sentences, captures the rhythmical nature of the painting. But also, as I said, that sense of alienation, isolation, that sense of, am I good enough? That doubt, that kind of vulnerability which comes with being an artist. She captures that incredibly well, and it's all inward. We get the kind of the inner complexity, the psychological processing. This isn't a plot-driven narrative. It's, as I said, it's a more of a kind of contemplative, philosophical, reflective novel. Now, if we move on, we see that this kind of impressionistic style reaches its zenith or its height in The Waves. Now, The Waves is generally regarded by critics as Virginia Woolf's most lyrical and experimental novel, with its prose attaining to a kind of poetic dimension. And you can see that in these kind of extracts there to a certain extent. And again, I know that we're running out of time a little bit, but if we can just focus on those. This is from the very, very opening of The Waves. The sun had not yet risen. The sea was indistinguishable from the sky, except that the sea was slightly creased, as if a cloth had wrinkles in it. Gradually, as the sky whitened, a dark line lay on the horizon, dividing the sea from the sky, and the grey cloth became barred with thick strokes, moving one after another beneath the surface, following each other, pursuing each other perpetually. As they neared the shore, each bar rose, heaped itself, broke and swept a thin veil of white water across the sand. The wave passed and then drew out again, sighing like a sleeper whose breath comes and goes unconsciously. Gradually, the dark bar on the horizon became clear, as if the sediment in an old wine bottle had sunk and left the glass green. Behind it, too, the sky cleared, as if the white sediment there had sunk, or as if the arm of a woman couched beneath the horizon had raised a lamp, and flat bars of white, green and yellow spread across the sky like the blades of a fan. Then she raised her lamp higher, and the air seemed to become fibrous, and to tear away from the green surface, flickering and flaming in red and yellow fibres, like the smoky fire that roars from a bonfire. Gradually, the fibres of the burning bonfire were fused into one haze, one incandescence, which lifted the weight of the woolen grey sky on top of it and turned it a million atoms of soft blue. The surface of the sea slowly became transparent and lay rippling and sparkling until the dark stripes were almost rubbed out. Slowly, the arm that held the lamp raised it higher, and then higher, until a broad flame became visible. An arc of fire burnt on the rim of the horizon, and all round it the sea blazed gold. The light struck upon the trees in the garden, making one leaf transparent and then another. So you can see, in many ways, Woolf's interest in post-impressionist painting, the conversations she's had with her sister Vanessa Bell, are really reflected in that very, very painterly style. The way in which she kind of explores the kind of the transient nature of light, the shifting colours, the shifting forms. That really is that kind of the epitome of that literary impressionistic style, with its focus on how the self perceives and makes sense of that kind of that horizon and the sea, with the kind of shifting, fleeting notions of light and color. So in the waves, we see, as I say, the kind of zenith of, or the real height, the extreme form of this kind of literary impressionistic style. And again, there's an extract on the right which also kind of captures the internal monologue, or the stream of consciousness style that she takes to an even greater extent. Now, in terms of what she was doing here, in many ways, Virginia Woolf wasn't on her own. As I said, there were a number of writers at this time who were also kind of experimenting with these ideas, and in many ways experimenting with not plot-driven narratives, but focusing on an ordinary mind, on an ordinary day, and focusing on the quotidian, and finding something profound and revelatory in the ordinary, in the everyday. And one of these was James Joyce, who you may be familiar with, who, like Virginia Woolf, was really interested in the inner workings of the mind and the way in which psychologically we kind of perceive the world around us. And he wrote this mammoth kind of novel, this extraordinary tome called Ulysses, which has these kind of Homeric echoes, but primarily it's over 1,000 pages, and it focuses on a handful of characters, and basically it focuses on one day, on a single day, and nothing really happens on that one day, but it charts the movements of Stephen Dedalus and also Bloom over the course of a single day, and the various things they get up to. At the time, it was very controversial because of its in part its sexually explicit content, but also at times it was seen to be quite blasphemous. But what Joyce tries to do is not that dissimilar from what Virginia Woolf tries to do in terms of playing around with these ideas of time, perception, memory, but also trying to capture this kind of stream of consciousness style. But if anything, perhaps Joyce is less musical and less lyrical. Another kind of writer who was trying to do a similar thing was Catherine Mansfield. Now, Catherine Mansfield was struck down with TB, which she probably caught from D.H. Lawrence, and therefore, because of her illness, she struggled with stamina, and she didn't have the energy to kind of commit to writing a novel. So therefore, she wrote lots of short stories, but many of her short stories are again in the style of this kind of literary impressionistic style that we see Virginia Woolf adopt. And indeed, when she died in 1923 from TB, she was only in her early 30s. Virginia Woolf really kind of noted the death of Catherine Mansfield, with whom she had quite a complex relationship. They knew one another. She kind of sneered at Catherine Mansfield, who was a New Zealand writer, but she felt she was quite common. Virginia Woolf was quite aloof, and she kind of said, "It is strange to trace the progress of one's feelings in relation to Mansfield's death. A shock of relief, a rival less." She goes on to say that Mansfield's writing was the only writing I've ever been jealous of. So we see that actually Virginia Woolf saw Catherine Mansfield as an actual rival. So as I say, there are a number of writers who are doing similar things to Virginia Woolf at this time. James Joyce capturing that stream of consciousness style, not having a plot-driven narrative, writing over 1,000 kind of pages, focusing on just on the normal everyday quotidian events of a single day. But Catherine Mansfield choosing a different form, the short story form, but again using that kind of impressionistic style. If we look at the opening paragraph of this story, At the Bay: "Very early morning, the sun was not yet risen, and the whole of Crescent Bay was hidden under a white sea mist. The big bush-covered hills at the back were smothered. You could not see when they ended and the paddocks and bungalows began. The sandy road was gone and the paddocks and bungalows the other side of it. There were no white dunes covered with reddish grass beyond them. There was nothing to mark which was beach and where was the sea. A heavy dew had fallen, the grass was blue, big drops hung on the bushes and just did not fall. The silvery, fluffy toy was limp on its long stalks, and all the marigolds and the pinks in the bungalow gardens were bowed to the earth with wetness. Drenched with the cold fuchsias, round pearls of dew lay on the flat nasturtium leaves. It looked as though the sea had beaten up softly in the darkness, as though one immense wave had come rippling, how far? Perhaps if you had walked up in the middle of the night, you might have seen a big fish flicking in at the window and gone again. Now, there are lots of passages which, again, play on these ideas of light and colour, but also, though we haven't got time to look at it today, again, lots of kind of internal stream of conscious, internal monologues. So she was doing a very, very similar thing. Now, just drawing to an end and kind of wrapping up. So, as I said right at the very beginning, Woolf was beset by some very, very profound kind of mental health issues, and indeed she took her own life on the morning of March the 28th in 1941 in the River Ouse near her home in Rodmill, Lewis. She'd been worried for some time. It was the Second World War. She married Leonard Woolf, who was a Jew, and apparently some kind of intelligence had come to light that they were on a list that if the Germans did invade England, that the Woolfs, Leonard and Virginia, were on a kind of a kill list. They were targets for the Nazis. So therefore, this kind of exacerbated her mental health anxieties, but also she had real kind of anxiety about her own abilities as a writer, and she suffered from extreme bouts of mental kind of health illness. So on the morning of March the 28th, she kind of wrote a letter to her husband, had a brief conversation with the maid, and then she walked to the River Ouse, regrettably filled her pockets with stones and walked into the river and never came back. And several days later, her body was found. So a tragic end to what was an incredible life. And her legacy, as I say here, is considerable. When we look back on Virginia Woolf's life, she is not only heralded now as one of the most influential feminist writers of modern times, but her experimental form revolutionized the novel and also expanded its possibilities through an impressionistic aesthetic, which offered new expressions of being. So Virginia Woolf led a very, very troubled, a very complex life, but her legacy is considerable. So I do encourage you, if you haven't already, do please take a look at the writing of Virginia Woolf. As I say, Mrs. Dalloway is perhaps one of her most celebrated novels, but do have a look at To the Lighthouse, have a look at The Waves, have a look at some of her literary criticism, and not least have a look at her kind of feminist polemic, A Room of One's Own. So we've ran over. I apologise profusely for that. But hopefully that's given you a bit of a sense of Virginia Woolf as a writer, what characterized her writing style and the way in which she sits within that kind of modernist period, and how what she was doing was very different from the writers who came before her, but also how she was very much in conversation with the kind of impressionist and post-impressionist painters of the time. So there we go, Virginia Woolf. Hopefully that's been of some interest to you. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Foster. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you, Dr. Hart. That was an absolutely fascinating lecture. I'm afraid I've been throwing questions all over the place, but does anybody actually have a question for Dr. Hart before we wind up? I do understand that we have gone over here, so you might actually need to be going off to have your supper. But if has anybody got a burning question that they'd like to ask, and if so, can you actually type it into the Q&A, please. And while we're doing that, Dr. Hart, I'll just ask you one question, but if nobody else has any questions, then we will wind up fairly soon, actually. I'm going to show my complete ignorance here, actually. But were the social and economic conditions absolutely key in the production of the way that she produced her impressionistic works? Yeah, I think you can see on there, on the Q&A, I've said, what factors do we need to think about to be at the present day then to produce a work of literary excellence? Or are the social and economic factors not important as an author writes because they're descending into themselves? Is that a more effective author?
Well, I think Virginia Woolf was very, very fortunate. So because she did come from a very, very kind of upper middle class family, she had the privilege of money. So therefore, she wanted to create a new literary aesthetics, and she wanted to kind of reject previous conventions. Now, a lot of publishers wouldn't have touched her new style at all, and her early novels, The Voyage Out and Night and Day, follow a very traditional kind of love story, romance type narrative. But she felt as though she was compromising her own integrity by following this normal plot driven narrative. So when her husband suggested that in order to try and give her something else to focus on, rather than focus on her mental health issues, that he bought her this printing press, and actually they discovered it was good fun and they started to become increasingly more proficient. She was able to print or able to write and therefore print and publish what she wanted to write. So therefore, because of her own economic conditions, she was able to write what she wanted, to create this new kind of literary aesthetic and actually publish it to the public. And they had it was kind of advertised in newspapers, and they had a kind of subscription, so people would subscribe. So she was able to do that. In terms of today, how does that work? Well, with the advent of social media and with the advent of the digital age that we live in, people do try and do that now, don't they, with self-publishing. And a number of people do try and self-publish. But I think Virginia Woolf was very, very fortunate because of her financial circumstances. She could reject the publishers and the pressure of having to write for a particular publisher and be accepted and get a contract. She could create her own literary aesthetic and be able to publish it herself. So she was quite fortunate because of that.
Thank you. Has anybody got any questions? There are a lot of questions, but I'm afraid they're mine, and I'm not going to hog up the whole place, right? I'm sure you and I, Dr. Hart, could have a conversation about some of these things, because it was absolutely very thought-provoking, and I'm sure a lot of you will go away and reflect on this. And I'm sure, should you have any questions, having reflected on it, Dr. Hart would love a conversation with you. However, I can't see any other questions here. So perhaps we should wind up this evening. It is supper time now. Thank you so much, Dr. Hart. We will be inviting you again. That was absolutely amazing. And we will finish for this evening, but please go away and actually reflect on the multidisciplinary nature of that talk as well, because it was fascinating to see that you were bringing artists such as William Morris and some of the pre-Raphaelites into it. It was, and the Impressionists. It was actually really very interesting. So thank you very much, Dr. Hart.
My pleasure. I'm sorry I went on for so long, but thank you very much. Thank you.
Perhaps we'd like to show our appreciation to Dr. Hart. You are able to do some reactions if you would like. Okay.